Chapter 1. The Summer of 85. In 1985, I went to live on the other side of the peace line. Everyone said my head was cut. It was the summer of Live Aid, and Bob Geldof pledged to save Africa from hunger. My ambitions were more modest. I wanted to stop fighting between Catholics and Protestants in Belfast. In June of that year, I started working as a volunteer for a new Christian charity, the 174 Trust. Our mission was to transform 174 Antrim Road into a drop-in centre for the people who lived in one of the most neglected and violent parts of Belfast. The youth unemployment rate was 90%, and the area had the highest concentration of sectarian killings in Northern Ireland. So many people had died on the streets here that the area was known as Murder Mile. The 174 Trust was set up by a few of the Protestant churches on the lower Antrim Road. These churches found themselves in a mainly Catholic area due to the changing sectarian demographics of Belfast. The familiar pattern across the city was one side moving out and the other side moving in, which was just what had happened here. Most Protestant churches that found themselves in the same position at that time lingered on, hoping that their buildings would avoid becoming carpet showrooms for Catholics. But in this area of North Belfast, some of the church leaders were talking about an exciting new concept called inner city ministry. It was a model of outreach that was just as concerned about people's social needs as their spiritual state. This was my kind of faith. As I emerged from childhood, my Jesus was steadily becoming less Billy Graham and more Martin Luther King, and not very Ulster Presbyterian at all. Churches obsessed with flowers, roof repairs and organs turned me off. I was attracted to believers with a passion for peace, justice and the poor. So to make myself useful, I volunteered to help clearing out the charity's premises, which were located where the New Lodge Road meets the Antrim Road and where Catholics rarely meet Protestants. I was warned repeatedly that it was dangerous for a Protestant from the top of the Shankill Road to be doing youth work on the streets in an IRA stronghold. Looking back, my fearlessness disturbs me. I knew there was much to fear in North Belfast. The embattled population had already endured years of riots, bombs, shootings, abductions, torture, and bodies dumped in the Belfast hills. This was a place where terror had become normal. For many people from my background, God was an angry old orange man waving his finger at them from the heavens like some giant cosmic paisley. My God was gentle, compassionate, forgiving, and wanted an end to violence, poverty, and inequality. Driven by this belief, I suppressed my fear and took the road less travelled by in the hope that it would make a difference. I dismissed the misgiving of others, and along with a group of similarly minded volunteers from different parts of Northern Ireland, England, and the USA, I followed my convictions. In July, our crew of student volunteers redirected our focus from manual work on the old building to youth work on the streets. While the traditional summer riots raged around us, and as the fighting over parades in Portadown exploded, we ran summer scheme activities every day for hundreds of children and young people in Dunkern Presbyterian Church Hall. We ran the children's club in the mornings and the teenager club in the evenings. One day it was games, Bible stories and a trip to the seaside, and the next it was arts and crafts, quizzes and a barbecue in the forest. It was tough when someone stole the footballs or broke the windows, but it was great crack nonetheless. I valued the warm camaraderie amongst the volunteers, and I loved meeting the young people, even the ones that called me a specky good living bastard. As a result of the exodus of Protestants from the lower Antrim Road, most of the young people on the summer scheme were from the other side, while most of the volunteer youth workers were from our side. This was very unusual because even when it came to evangelism in Belfast, you tended to stick with your own. Why would you want to stop your enemy from going to hell? For as long as I could remember, I had been sick and tired of all the talk of sides in this city. Everyone knew how to work out what side you were from in the first 2 minutes of meeting you. What's your name? Where do you come from? What school did you go to? What team do you support? I didn't care what side you were from, as long as you didn't want to hurt anyone from the other side. The youngest children on our summer scheme were oblivious to sides, and I loved their innocence. When the summer scheme ended and the kids were getting ready to go back to school, I helped with the continuing renovations of the 3-storey terrace at 174 Antrim Road, removing dead pigeons and several years of their shit from the staircases, painting fresh white gloss on skirting boards and scraping wood chip wallpaper from walls in the flats above the ground floor shop unit. We had been using the old shop unit as a makeshift cafe and youth club venue for a while now, but once the latest renovations were completed, the Salt Shaker Cafe and drop-in centre were reopened. At first, only a few people ventured in and there was some suspicion that we were a cult. But gradually, local people who were curious about what them Christians were up to dropped in, and when they discovered that they would not be preached at over their Ulster fry, more local residents began to discover that the centre was a warm and friendly gathering place. As part of my summer volunteering, I put on an apron, prepared fried eggs and soda bread and microwaved burgers in the kitchen, and served cups of tea to our new customers. I felt self-conscious that I was obviously not from round here, and I had Protestant written all over me. Some people didn't seem to mind. "You're a lovely big fella, so you are," commented some of the pensioners. Others were clearly trying to work out if I was a threat. "Are you a fucking Hun?" inquired a few of the teenagers. September came, and except for one unsuccessful application to Cooperation North, there was no sign of a job for me, and I was starting to get worried. Earlier in the summer, I had graduated from the University of Ulster at Coleraine with a BA Honours degree in Media Studies. I was the first person in my family ever to get a degree. My mother and father had beamed with pride as my name was called to step forward to receive my degree from the Vice-Chancellor. This was family history, and the result of all their years of hard work and sacrifice to make sure their son got a good education no matter what. Graduation day was a welcome relief from the depression that seemed to have engulfed my parents while I was away at university. In their eyes, I was the sole graduate in the class of 85. After the ceremony, they cried and hugged me over the strawberries and cream. It was as if I had passed 1,011 pluses. My professor shook my father's hand nervously, with an uncharacteristic awkwardness that confirmed my long-held suspicions that he was more comfortable lecturing about the plight of the working man than speaking to one. We queued for a photographer who charged us almost as much as my father earned in a week at the foundry. I stood proudly in my new suit from man at C&A, clutching a scroll and trying to look clever. But beneath the mortarboard and my well-gelled mullet lurked the knowledge that I had been rejected from the media courses I had applied for in Dublin and Belfast, and that the BBC had turned me down as a newsreader after an ill-fated screen test when I had mispronounced half the locations in Ulster. I needed a start. At the foundry where my parents worked, young people who left school with no qualifications used to ask for a start, and my father, who was a foreman, used to be able to sort them out. In fact, he once got a death threat wrapped in a bullet for giving a start to a Catholic. But nowadays, there was more talk of redundancies and layoffs. My father was living in dread of a sudden announcement that the whole foundry would close down and he would lose the job he had worked at since he was 16 years old. I couldn't imagine the whole of Mackey's closing down, but I knew it was struggling to compete with companies in other parts of the world. Anyway, they didn't need any media studies graduates, so I had to look in other directions. By late September, I was signing on the dole, in the Snugville Street Unemployment Bureau alongside everyone else in the Shankill Road. My academic prowess counted for nothing. I couldn't get a job without experience, and I couldn't get experience without a job. My university days were a happily ended story, and this felt like the hard, cold start of the first chapter of a darker book. Up until this time in my life, everything I had tried my best to do had been a success. My experience was that if you worked hard, you would do well. At first I was confident that by the end of my summer of volunteering for peace, I would find a job. But 3 months after graduating and a series of failed applications, I was beginning to have doubts. At least my personal life was happy. I was engaged to Lesley. We had met at university and fallen in love over endless cups of coffee and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. I had persuaded the bank manager to grant me an overdraft facility specifically so that I could buy Lesley a Princess Diana engagement ring. I had volunteered in the summer schemes ever since I had left school, and Lesley had joined me for the past 2 years. The children loved Lesley's enthusiasm and lively personality almost as much as I did, and found her country accent just as different and funny as those of the American volunteers. The older teenagers were aghast at our chaste relationship. On one quizzing about our lack of sex life, on the way home in the minibus from a seaside barbecue in Drains Bay, Big Mickey was incredulous when I confessed that we were waiting until we were married. "Wise up, mister, you're a fucking liar," he said. "Or not near wise in the head," contributed Den. "Or a wanker as well as a specky bastard," added Tonto. I assured them I certainly wasn't a liar. Lesley was a fellow graduate of the class of 85, but she was back home up the country now and living with her parents again in Belfast. She had just been offered a place on a prestigious postgraduate management scheme in Belfast. The interviewers had obviously been impressed with her engaging personality and good business sense. I was delighted, but Lesley's success only added to the pressure I was feeling. Hopefully she would stick by me and get married for poorer for a little while in the hope I might at some stage manage for richer. If I ever lost confidence, Lesley put me right. "You've no idea, wee lad," she said. "You've got potential." These supportive words told me all I needed to know. Lesley believed in me. It had also been harder than I expected to move back home. My parents were still working in Mackey's, my mother in the wages office and my father in the foundry. My younger brother Barry was often at rugby practice after school at Belfast Royal Academy, following in his two brothers' footsteps. The school, not the rugby in my case. Terry, my older brother, was married now and had a good job in shorts and moved to Bangor. Yes, the three Macaulay brothers' names were Terry, Tony and Barry. Lesley referred to us as Huey, Dewey and Louie. It was strange to be back home in my childhood bedroom after 3 years away in freezing student digs in Port Stewart. The walls were still bereft of the posters I had removed when I had moved out, but there were still a few bits and pieces around me from my childhood. Alongside my piles of Guardian newspapers, academic books, classic novels and Bible commentaries lurked a remote-controlled Dalek and the Whizzer and Chips Annual 1976. My room felt familiar and comfortable, but living with my parents at the age of 22 was a backward step. I was used to living with my peers who were full of crack and energy, but returning home I found that both my parents were on antidepressants. The strains of the Troubles, along with a lack of job security, seemed to have drained much of the joy from their lives. Since I last lived at home, both my mother's parents had passed away. My grandfather died suddenly after setting fire to his bed while smoking. My grandmother's insistence on staying in her own home and her constant demands became overwhelming, and after one particularly stormy argument, my mother had a nervous breakdown. My father had been drinking heavily at home for several years now and was little support to my mother. When it became clear that my grandmother needed professional care, she was moved into the Salvation Army nursing home, and after a few months she died there. My mother's depression deepened, and my father's guilt for not supporting her increased. The day my mother was admitted to the psychiatric hospital, my father poured every bottle of alcohol in our house down the drain. He never drank again, but descended into his own depression. I felt helpless. I wanted to make them better, but I didn't know how. When I moved home, I tried to cheer them up, but I had my own life too, and sometimes I felt guilty for just wanting to get away from all the gloom. I didn't want to end up middle-aged and miserable like them, and I was already feeling more despondent by the day. Naively, I concluded that the best thing I could do was to get a job that would make them proud, so they would know that all their sacrifices for my education had not been in vain. So when the 174 Trust advertised the position of director, I applied straight away. Not long after, a letter arrived in the post. As I tentatively unfolded the paper, I spotted the logo of the 174 Trust at the top of the page. The Reverend Patton Taylor, a red-haired Presbyterian minister from Scotland, had signed the letter personally in blue ink. As a result of his radical views on the church actually daring to help poor people in the inner city, the Reverend Taylor was the founding chairman of the trust. I read his typed words excitedly. Dear Tony, thank you for your application for the post of the director of the 174 Trust. We would like to invite you for an interview. I phoned Lesley straight away. I've got an interview, I shouted. Lesley gave one of her finest Balaki whoops of excitement. The next week, I attended the interview. A few days later, I received a letter telling me I hadn't got the job, as it had been offered to a 40-year-old Baptist pastor from Wales called John Evans, but tantalisingly inviting me to a second interview. After this interview with the Board of Trustees, I was offered the job of Assistant Director of the 174 Trust on the condition that I moved to live in the local community. And so, in a matter of weeks, I had to make the move from the Shankill to the new lodge. While the distance between the two areas was short, the difference between them was vast. I would have to live on the other side of the peace line. I knew that for most people in Belfast, such a move was pure madness. I had hardly been born with a silver spoon in my mouth, but the level of poverty and alienation from the state in the new lodge was on a different scale to any I had previously experienced. It was one thing to volunteer for a few weeks every summer, but now I was going to live and work here every day. I was determined to reach across the barriers that divided my city. That idealism was soon to be shaken.